Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio, and this is your host, Webster Tarpley, reporting from Washington, D.C., and this is our Labor Day edition of the program. So we're going to talk about labor. We're going to talk about labor history, that very important component of American history that the foreigners of the Austrian school, the subversives around von Hayek and von Mises, forgot to tell you about. They're not interested in that. And, of course, Milton Friedman and his gang of Chicago boy thugs, infamous throughout the Third World, from Poland to Chile and every place in between, they also forgot to tell you that the elementary preconditions of your daily life were never granted by any free market. The free market, if you will, is, of course, it's a mystification, but what they mean by free market, in other words, Wall Street finance capital, was always ferociously opposed to the essential amenities and conditions of life. Do you think that the 8-hour day came about by some kind of automatic process? Did the Wall Street gang and industrial bosses get together and say, oh, well, we have to modernize, let's go for the 8-hour day, we need to have some leisure time for the workers? No. And, of course, the 8-hour day right now is under tremendous attack. It has been for the last couple of decades. The 8-hour day looks like it was something that we had from the 1930s until about the 1970s or 80s. And since the reign of stupid Reagan, reactionary Reagan, the union buster, the 8-hour day has been under attack. How about something like the 5-day week? You think that was automatic too? Older people can remember into the 1950s, you were expected to show up, if not a whole day on Saturday, then at least a half day on Saturday. And then there's that question of free, universal, compulsory public education of some quality. The reactionaries, the people you'd call today the Austrians, or the Chicago boys, the proto-fascists, the extreme right-wingers, and so forth, they never wanted to pay for free, universal, compulsory public education. And at the middle of the entire issue, the United States, to a traditionalist, to anybody who is really got some element of conservatism, the element of the United States that stands out is this was always a high-wage economy. High wage, high value-added, high capital density, high energy density. And that is the success story of the U.S. economy into the 60s and even into the 70s. And, of course, then under Carter, Reagan, and the common denominator of both, Volcker, we get the transition to a low-wage, low capital intensity, low energy intensity, low value-added, failing economy. And remember, then, that you can't have a healthcare system that's appropriate for an advanced industrial society unless you have an advanced industrial society. You can't make that work with a deindustrialized moonscape and crater field of rubble. So remember, the elementary conditions of your everyday life are due to mass struggle, labor struggle. We've talked about the political aspects of the struggle, the abolition of slavery with Lincoln, the necessity of a civil war to break the power of the predatory Southern planter aristocracy in league with the British Empire and other foreign forces, including Napoleon III of France. But specifically at this area, it's the question of labor. Labor struggles gave you the living standard you enjoy today, not the market. The market would never have done it. And, of course, the market simply means it's a mystification to cover the nefarious activities of whoever's running Wall Street at any given time. So labor history, American labor history, not Austrian labor history, not Chicago boy, meaning dumbed-down Austrian labor history, but the real thing. Now, in the middle of all this, we've got to remember, you're dealing with reactionary Republicans, people like Robert Taft, and so many today, right? We have Sharon Engel. We have all kinds of extreme reactionary Republicans running around, some of them disguised as libertarians. That's the best camouflage for a reactionary Republican these days. But in addition to that, you've got Wall Street Democrats. Now, the difference is that the Republicans generally represent low-wage sweatshop industries. especially in the anti-union so-called right-to-work states of the South. You get the low-wage employer, to some degree, runaway shops who have fled the North or the Northeast or the Northwest into the South, very often owned by foreigners, by Japanese or others. So that's the Republicans. But the Wall Street side of it is generally the Democratic Party. And we can, before we even start our historical review, identify the current in the Democratic Party, it's generally the dominant one, of Wall Street Democrats. And one of the worst of these is Grover Cleveland. His name should live in infamy. This is the guy who capitulated to J.P. Morgan in the great financial crisis of 1894, 1895, the Cross of Gold, when he capitulated to Morgan and London and made the U.S. government an extension of Wall Street and the city of London. He's also a guy who did his best to break strikes using federal troops against strikers. And that tradition then goes on with Woodrow Wilson, with Harry S. Truman, with Jimmy Carter, and, of course, with Obama. So those are your Wall Street Democrats. Clinton is half and half. Ultimately, we better call Clinton a Wall Street Democrat, too, although he's not quite as vicious as some of these others, largely because he didn't succeed in doing what he wanted to do. We ought to start the labor movement after the Civil War. Let's just say a few words. There were, of course, unions before the Civil War, in particular in the Northeast. Martin Van Buren, one of the henchmen and retainers of the treasonous Andrew Jackson, himself a disciple of Aaron Burr, but Van Buren, of course, vice president for Jackson. And this was essentially the New York faction, the Albany Regency. And this included some craft unions and some other unions. A lot of these unions, though, were then swept away by the handiwork of the Jackson administration, which was, of course, the worst financial panic in the history of the United States, the Panic of 1837, which basically crushed everything that had existed up to that time. So that was the thank you that those craft unionists got from Jackson and Van Buren. They were then destroyed by this flood of unemployed workers in the Panic of 1837. That was a panic created directly by Jackson's attack on Biddle and the Bank of the United States. So by your fruits, you will know them. After the Civil War, you have the conditions which are to some degree favorable for labor development, and this includes the industrialization of the country, made possible through the protective tariff, not the free market, not any of that baloney, but the protective tariff imposed by the Republicans once the Confederates had left the Congress. It was clear sailing. What you couldn't get through before that, since they were gone, you slapped on a protective tariff, and the United States quickly grew to be the world's greatest industrial power, with the help, of course, of Civil War munitions orders and other things. So the protective tariff is essentially the most important single precondition for the emergence of the United States from 1865 until about 1910. You've also got the other thing that the Confederates would not abide, and which we see today in the neo-Confederate Tea Party movement. That is internal improvements paid for at federal expense, even if they're only in one state. And again, if it's the Port of New Orleans, that's a national resource. You got to have it, whether it's in one state or not, is totally immaterial. And the big example, of course, generally of this principle is the Transcontinental Railway, greatest engineering achievement in world history up to that time, although soon to be outclassed by Count Witta's Trans-Siberian Railway. That kind of thing, the Erie Canal before the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad. This sets the stage then for a period of labor growth. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.